I would like to invite Professor Maron Medzini. He's here with us on the stage. This is the first presentation. Professor Medzini, thank you so much for making the efforts to come and to be here with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Excellency, the Ambassador of Japan, my friend Aryeh Kutz, Director of the museums, colleagues, friends, curators, ladies and gentlemen. I didn't make that much of an effort. I came from Jerusalem. Some people feel that Jerusalem may be not exactly part of where we are, but here I am. And I am delighted to be here, and the task that was accorded to me was to provide a background for the policy of Japan towards the Jews, specifically during the Holocaust. And I will do so, since I have about, 15 minutes, I will do so in a telegraphic fashion and try and explain what basically took place. Now, during the Second World War, 5 countries were involved in rescuing, helping, providing assistance to Jews. 4 of them Europe, 1 in Asia. The European countries were Spain, Denmark, Sweden, and Bulgaria. The Asian country was Japan. This is the first point. Second point, Japan was responsible at the height of the Second World War for about 40,000 Jews. At least 27,000 of them lived in Shanghai. There were several hundreds in the home islands. There were several thousands in Manchuria, and then in territories occupied by Japan at the beginning of the Second World, the Pacific War, specifically Hong Kong, Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and Indonesia. Third point, Japan was formerly an ally of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Although the military collaboration, and in fact any other collaboration, was minimal. But Japan signed on September 27, 1940, the Axis Treaty. Japan, however, told the Germans on more than one occasion, either in Berlin or in Tokyo, we do not accept your ideological position regarding Jews. This is something that doesn't concern us, and therefore in no place are we going to be involved in what you are doing towards what eventually became known as the final solution. Jews came to Japan in the 1860s, after the opening of Japan by the Americans, 1853-54. The first Jewish community was in Nagasaki, mostly Russian Jews, and that community existed until about 1921-22. It disappeared predominantly because of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. The Jews, most of them being Russians, became actually enemy aliens. And therefore the community dwindled, and by 1921-22 they sold the synagogue, and the community basically dispersed. The second Jewish community of note was in Yokohama from about 1859. There's a cemetery, there are Jewish graves there, and Jews did not play a major role in the life of that community, but at least there was Jewish presence there. That community survived until the earthquake of 1923, when Yokohama and parts of Tokyo were destroyed. Most of the Jews who survived from Yokohama ended up in Tokyo after it was rebuilt. Some went to the third Jewish community, which still exists very much to this very day, and that's in Kobe. Kobe is different than Yokohama and Nagasaki by the virtue of the fact that at least half of the Jews who settled in Kobe came from Middle Eastern countries. In Asia, they're known as the Baghdadis. Came from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, mostly via India, Singapore, China, and on to Japan. Jews were not visible in Japanese life for a number of reasons. The first and most important, they did not speak the language. They did not marry local Japanese women. They were considered by the Japanese people as part of the foreigners community. Gaijin, they were foreigners. Some noted that Jews prayed, instead of praying like everybody else, they prayed on Saturday. And they had something affixed to the doors of their homes, and some of them ate special food, and they circumcised their children, and the direction of the prayer was not towards the east, but rather towards the west. Why Jews never played a very important role, I would suggest to you, mostly because of language. If you don't have the language, you cannot be involved in politics, media, academia, professions, trade unions. All those things were Jews in Europe and America and South America and other places who were very much involved and highly visible. In Japan, they were not visible at all, and we're talking in the home islands, we're talking about several hundreds of Jews. Most of them representatives of foreign companies. As a result, you don't have the Jewish landlord. You don't have the Jewish money lender. You don't have the Jewish who owns the stores, as you had in, let's say, Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and France, England, and other places. If you would ask the average Japanese, can you point out a Jew? Probably say no. Most Japanese never met a Jew in their lives. Japan encountered the Jewish world, I would say even Jewish power, during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, alluded to by Aryakutz. While Japan was doing extremely well on the battlefield, especially after capturing Port Arthur, among the prisoners taken in Port Arthur was Joseph Trompeldor, who spent 8 months in a Japanese prisoners of war camp. The trouble was that Japan basically was bereft of foreign currency with which to continue to finance the war. And for that purpose, the deputy head of the Bank of Japan, Takahashi, I think his name was Korekiyo Takahashi, was sent to Europe with the order, get some money, get loans. By sheer accident, he was sitting next to an American Jewish banker, Jacob Schiff, at a dinner party in London. Schiff was anti-Zionist, didn't believe in the idea of a Jewish state, but Schiff hated the Russians because of the pogroms of 1903, and was determined to help Japan win the war against Russia, hoping that this somehow would alleviate the position of Jews in Russia. Schiff heard the story and said, we'll put together a consortium of Jewish bankers from America, England, France, Germany, among them the Goldmans and the Sachses and the Kuhn and Loeb and Cassel and Rothschilds and he himself. He managed to get 2 loans worth at the time £80 million, which was a huge amount of money, and that enabled Japan to purchase food, ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. Japan did not win the war in a decisive manner. The Russians did not surrender, but the Jews played a role in bringing about the negotiation that led to a peace treaty between Russia and Japan. This is when the Japanese elite, the finance people, the army, the navy, the top politicians, are becoming aware of international Jewish power, the hold the Jews have on international finance, banking, politics, media. And there is a great deal of respect for this so-called Jewish power. Japan, for example, was very impressed with the idea, with the achievement of the World Zionist Organization in 1917, with the attainment of the Balfour Declaration. How was it possible for Jews to obtain a commitment from Great Britain, a superpower at the time, this Zionist organization without a country, dispersed throughout the nations? But this was extremely impressive achievement. And therefore, some Japanese began to pay attention. Who are these people? Among those who began to ask questions were Japanese who delved into Christianity. And it became obvious to them Christianity is an offshoot of Judaism, and therefore we have to study Judaism. And if the Jews were so important, and Jesus essentially was a Jew, then we want to know who were these Jews. And therefore, there's more attention being paid to Jews. The next major encounter is about after 1917, specifically 1920, when the Japanese became involved in an intervention in Siberia. And this is where they encountered quite a number of Jews. Because Japan essentially occupied parts of Siberia all the way down to Irkutsk, they needed specialists in Russian. People who would know more who the Russians are, what is the language, culture, civilization, what are the intentions. One of the people whom they recruited to study Russian was Sugihara. And Sugihara became what we used to call for years Sovietologist. He became an expert in Russian affairs. He studied in Manchuria, and this is the first time he met Jews, although his first wife was non-Jewish and most likely anti-Semitic. So this is when we encounter Sugihara, but we encounter something else. And that is the translation into Japanese of what became known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was an anti-Semitic tract. And this was distributed to Japanese soldiers and officers by white Russians who were exiled or refugees running away from Bolshevism. And they tended to blame all the ills of the world on Jews, the Russian Revolution, the murder of the Tsar, and they pointed out to the fact that most of the leadership of the Soviet Union were Jews, and they were right. The story at the time was that apart from Molotov, Stalin and somebody else, all the rest were Jews, starting with Trotsky. And here you have the beginning of anti-Semitism in Japan, and this is a curious thing, anti-Semitism in a country where there are no Jews, virtually no Jews. It's almost like Poland today. You don't have many Jews, but you have a lot of anti-Semitism. It was never street anti-Semitism. To the extent that there was anti-Semitic feelings, it was among some people in the army, maybe some politicians, who equated the Jews to Bolshevism. They said, here the Jews control the Soviet Union and therefore they're enemies of Japan. The next point is Japan encounters Jewish refugees. Until the mid-1930s, very few Jews ever thought of settling in Japan. Faraway country, you needed a visa. It's much easier to go to China, to Shanghai, where you did not need a visa. And therefore, very few Jews chose Japan as a place of refuge. After 1933, and especially after most of the world closed its gates to the Jews, as we saw at Evian conference, I think it was Chaim Weizmann who said the world is divided into two parts. The first want to kick the Jews out, and the second is those who don't want to let the Jews in. But very few Jews ever considered Japan as a haven. And therefore the Japanese government did not have to deal with the issue of Jewish refugees. This began to change around 1935, 36, 37. When more and more countries closed their gates, especially America. Americans have closed their gates since 1924. Palestine was still open. More and more Japanese consuls in various countries wrote to the foreign ministry in Tokyo saying, we are flooded by requests of Jews who wish to have visas to Japan. What do we do? And a high-level meeting took place in December 1938. Among the participants were the Big Five: the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Finance Minister, War Minister, and Navy Minister. Issue: what do we do with Jewish refugees? Answer: we treat them like other nationals. There was no discriminatory policy against the Jews. And orders, instructions in such a fashion went to the various Japanese consulates, embassies, mostly in Europe. One Japanese who became very much involved in helping Jews, whose name is not familiar to you, was General Higuchi Kiichiro, who was head of special branch in Manchuria. In late 1938, hundreds of Jews, probably running away from the purges that took place in the Soviet Union 37, 38, some of them from Birobidzhan, the Jewish autonomous area, found themselves stranded on the border between Soviet Union and Manchuria, then occupied by Japan. A place called Manchuli. And he was asked by the leaders of the Jewish community in Harbin in Manchuria, help. We want to get these people through down to Shanghai. And he approved the passage through Manchuria, then Japanese area, to Shanghai, talking about several hundreds. Before doing so, he asked the Prime Minister of Japan, his superior, General Tojo, who would be Prime Minister during the war, what do we do? And Tojo said, look, there could be a problem with Germany, who is now friendly to Japan. And General Higuchi said, listen, Germans can do whatever they want, not here. Here we are responsible. And therefore we have a problem. I'm going to deal with it on a humane fashion. And he approved the passage through Manchuria of several hundred Jews. By the way, his name is listed in the Golden Book of Jewish National Fund here in Jerusalem. I moved to the Holocaust. The Japanese did not know anything about the Holocaust, and they were not the only ones. There was no way they could know, because the Germans didn't bother to tell them. The Japanese diplomats were not aware, Japanese reporters were not aware, Japanese business people were not aware. In fact, until about early 1950s, most Japanese did not know anything about the Holocaust, unlike people in Europe. We can't fault the Japanese, by the way, but we here growing up, I grew up during the Mandate here, we didn't know about the Holocaust until late 1942. And therefore, Japan had to determine its policy once again, especially after it launched an attack against America, occupied very rapidly a third of China, Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Indonesia, parts of Burma. Another top-level meeting in March 1942. What do we do with the Jews? By now, there were about 40,000 Jews under Japanese domination. And once again, a repeat of the same policy. We will not discriminate against Jews, we'll treat them as other nationals, as long as they're not enemy aliens. In other words, British, American, Dutch. We will treat them like everybody else. During the war, the responsibility for Jews essentially was in the hands of local commanders. If the commander was decent, the treatment was relatively decent. If not, there could be problems. In one place, Jews were ordered to wear a sort of a yellow badge, you die. But in many others, for example in Philippines, Jews were allowed to continue living as though nothing special happened. The fact remains that while European Jewry perished, the 40,000 Jews under Japanese domination survived. Those who died, several scores, either illnesses, old age, in some cases hunger. In one case, bombing by the American Air Force of a radio station in Shanghai. Even in Shanghai, the Japanese decided to put German, Austrian, and Czech Jews in a special designated area, sort of a ghetto, called Hongqiu, where Nina Admoni found herself living. If I have 3 more minutes, a few words about Sugihara. There are quite a few myths about Sugihara. Essentially, he was an intelligence officer. He was not an ordinary diplomat. He was sent to Kaunas, to Kovna, in Lithuania, in the summer of 1939, and his instructions were, you are to report to us about the intentions of the Russians and the Germans. Are they going to abide by a treaty they signed or not? He did not encounter specifically Jews. What happened was, one day, several hundred Jews lined up his consulate outside the gates of his consulate. What they want? They wanted transit visas to Japan on their way to Curaçao and Suriname. Curaçao and Suriname were Dutch colonies in the Caribbean, under the responsibility of the Dutch government in exile, who discovered Curacao, 2 yeshiva students from Belgium, one is the Gutswirt family, I forget the name of the other, who told them about Curacao and Suriname. The honorary consul of Holland in Kaunas, a Dutchman by the name of Jan Zwartendijk, who told Zwartendijk, the Dutch ambassador de Dekker, Curacao and Aruba, you don't need a visa. Go there, the government will give you. And they were prepared, the Dutch, to give these Jews documents saying, he is proceeding to Curacao and Suriname. By the way, 2 places where most Jews never heard of and had no intention of going to. With this, they came to Sugihara and they said, we want transit visas to Japan. He informed his superiors. One of the myths was that he defied his superiors. He did not defy, as you saw in the film. There is a list of names. His superiors in the Japanese Foreign Ministry said, you can issue transit visas provided these people remain in Japan 3 weeks, provided they have money to sustain themselves. The money came from the joint. How it was distributed to the Jews, we will hear from our Japanese friends in a minute. He issued 2,160 visas, family visas, that essentially helped keep alive 6,000 Jews. He did not defy his authority, his superiors. He did not risk his life. He did not risk his family. He did not risk promotion. He was promoted later on. After the war, he was fired from the Japanese Foreign Service because everybody was fired from the Japanese Foreign Service. There was no need for a foreign ministry because Japan was occupied. So the myth is that he was fired and so on. No, he was not fired. He was like everybody else. He was given a compensation. And then he sort of disappeared until he was discovered by the Israeli commercial attaché in Tokyo in 1962, Aryeh Nesher. One of the people who was involved with him, Zer Warhaftig, whom many of you remember as signer of the Declaration of Independence, Minister Herodovus, Warhaftig invited him to come here. He came here and he met Prime Minister Eshkol. At the time I was Eshkol's spokesman, so I met Sugihara, shook his hand, was not aware of what happened. And his son was given a scholarship at the Hebrew University. Then arose the question, do we give him the award Chassidu Mot HaOlam, righteous Gentile? Ostensibly, he should not have gotten it because he didn't risk his life, didn't risk his family life. Did it before the Holocaust. This is all in July, August 1940. But the decision, and rightly so, was yes, he should be awarded. It was very important for us in Israel that the Japanese, through Sugihara, will learn what happened, and for the Japanese government to demonstrate that there were decent Japanese. Sugihara, Iguchi, probably a few others. And therefore, why did the Japanese behave the way they did? Philo-Semitism, no admiration for Jews, maybe fear. What would the Jews do to the Japanese if they lose the war and they would have mistreated Jews? There was another concern. They said, I remember some of the documents saying, look, if we're going to build concentration camps, it's very expensive, and you need guards for that, and logistically it's a complicated business. What do we need it for? But above all, Japanese were not tinged with anti-Semitism. And therefore, Jews essentially was treated as foreigners, but this was good enough for them to survive. The exhibition here, a film about Sugihara, is extremely important for us because after the war, especially after the publication of the diaries of Anna Frank, and later on the Eichmann trial, which was covered by quite a few Japanese reporters who came to Jerusalem, and because of the trial, were able to explain to their readers the need for a Jewish state. And that for Israel was extremely important. So I hope that this background will be useful as we listen to the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Medzini, so much. Please remember.